this big question. It made me think of this kind of time that we live in, and the sort of hopelessness I think that a lot of people are feeling. I was thinking a lot about what was happening in Congress with their inability to like even pick a speaker, and how just unhinged that was. And as Heidi and Lynn, of course, knows as well, we've been dealing with a lot in the UW system. Um, we've had over a decade of just budget cuts and people who literally don't want us to do the kind of job that we're signed up to do, right? To do right by our students. Um, I don't know. I might get in trouble for saying this, but I don't care because there's going to be some news articles about it this week anyway. Our chancellor wants our theater department to like come up with a plan to eliminate their own major. So these things are. Don't worry, we're fighting it. It's cool. But there's so many like things going on in the world where it makes you sometimes feel like how did we get ourselves into this situation where like things literally seem to be on fire. There's so many problems. The next few years politically could lead to, and as a historian, I don't make this comparison lightly to some version of fascism, right? I mean, I'm really worried about that, and probably many of you are too. And so it leads you to reassess things, right? Like what does it mean to be an American, and should we be hopeful for the future? And I'm here to tell you that we should be, okay? And the reason for that is because when we think about what it means to be an American, being an American, it isn't, the real tradition isn't the negative things, right? It isn't the mean-spiritedness and the nastiness and the closing things off and the real power inequality that exists in our society. That when people tell you that that's what it means to be an American, when they say "Make America Great," is to go back to a time in which Emmett Till was murdered, okay, in 1955. That's not America. That's not what it means to be an American. We have a different tradition, and don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise. So I thought what I would do today is to actually actually give some words from a few Americans that I really admire, who I think help us to understand that. Because you could listen to me say this, but what I want to tell you is we have a bigger tradition here, okay? So I need my phone because I promise you I'm not checking fantasy football scores. Although I do play in a very competitive fantasy football league with a bunch of leftist podcasters, so okay. That's the real thing. But I have a couple of quotes that I didn't have time to print out, so they're here. Um, I want to start with a quote by Michael Harrington, who is one of the founders of Democratic Socialists of America. I'm not a DSA member, although I admire a lot of their stuff. I'm probably not really a socialist, but I think this is, I think, a really, really important way to kind of look at things, all right, just to kind of to frame things. And so Harrington wrote this in 1973, very important American in the 70s. He said, it was as a socialist and because I was a socialist that I fell in love with America. In saying that, I'm not indulging in romantic nostalgia about youthful days on the road, but rather underlining a crucial political truth. If the left wants to change this country because it hates it, then the people will never listen to the left, and the people will be right. To be a socialist, to be a Marxist, is to make an act of faith, of love even, toward this land. It is to sense the seed beneath the snow, to see beneath the veneer of corruption and meanness and commercialization of human relationships, men and women capable of controlling their own destinies. To be a radical is, and I am a radical, is in the best and only decent sense of the word, patriotic, okay? And so I really find that to be meaningful, because here you have somebody on the left who would have, as a socialist, every reason to condemn the United States, but Harrington doesn't. And it really is about that idea of people controlling their own destinies. So when you start with the founding of the nation, and you start with what I think is the most important, really, couple of lines in American political theory in the Declaration of Independence, you start with that very idea of people creating their own political world, creating their own society in which they throw off hereditary power. okay? And so you all know the lines, right? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that governments are instituted to secure these rights. Wow, what a statement, right? And we sometimes you know, get caught up in the contradictions, and there were a lot of them, right? The man who wrote those words owned people, okay? Let's be honest about that. When those words were written in the very early days of American society, most of us in this room wouldn't have been able to participate in politics, right? Women certainly wouldn't have, African Americans certainly wouldn't have, I mean, many of them, most of them were enslaved, not all of them, but most of them. But actually, even if you were a man who didn't have a lot of property, in virtually every state you couldn't participate fully in politics. So this was a very limiting worldview, right? But you think about that promise, those words really matter. The idea that people are created equally. And Danielle Allen, the political theorist, says that Jefferson actually intended that to include men and women. You don't have to agree with that. We can talk more about that sometime. But that this is about universal, includes babies too. That this was a universal claim that even if it was limited, provided a very, very important promise that other Americans could push our nation to live up to. That's our tradition, okay? So you get to the 1840s and 1850s, and you get to the horrific contradiction of slavery, right? And you think about somebody like Frederick Douglass, who literally liberated himself, right? I don't know if you know much about Douglass's autobiography, but like there's a physical fight with this person called, he was a slave breaker. And Douglass, I shouldn't curse. Douglass whipped his butt, right? Physically. Right, and that was the sort of beginning path to Douglass's liberation. And at a time in the 1840s and 1850s, when white abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison were publicly burning the Constitution and saying, this nation is hopelessly corrupt, Douglass took the opposite approach to that, okay? And in a famous speech that I love, that you all, how long do I have, an hour and 45 minutes today? Okay, we'll keep this short. In a speech that I love from 1852, called "What to the Slave is the 4th of July." You hear this every 4th of July, right? And you know, you'll see this quoted on, it's a long speech, I apologize, but he was giving it to a religious audience, this speech, and really condemning the clergy for being complicit with, the northern clergy for being complicit with slavery. But there are lines that you recognize probably because you see them on social media. He says, this is the most famous one, "What to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer," and you can just picture him saying this, right? I mean, this guy, there's no audio recordings, but you can just imagine the kind of order he was. "I answer, a day that reveals to him, more than all other days in the year, the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham, your boasted liberty an unholy license, your national greatness swelling vanity. There is not a nation on the earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of these United States at this very hour." Now, if you stop reading the speech there, okay, that looks pretty hopeless. I mean, and you think about what could have been a more hopeless situation for a human being on the planet than the institution of slavery in the South, okay? But this is where Douglass concludes the speech. He has this round condemnation, argues that the nation has to actually uphold its own principles. And he says, this is how he concludes, he says, and a lot of people don't read all the way through this, "Now take the Constitution according to its plain reading, and I defy the presentation of a single pro-slavery clause in it. On the other hand, it will be found to contain principles and purposes entirely hostile to the existence of slavery. Allow me to say," and man, can we remember this in the next couple of weeks here? "Allow me to say, in conclusion, notwithstanding the dark picture I have this day presented of the state of the nation, I do not despair of this country. There are forces in operation which must inevitably work the downfall of slavery." And what he was talking about was the nation's promise. He was saying that the Garrison and the abolitionists who wanted to burn the Constitution, that doesn't give you a way out. The way out is to force this nation to uphold those ideals. And Douglass, as a great American, that's our tradition, right? It's not John D. Rockefeller building wealth on the backs of workers. It's Frederick Douglass. That's who we are as Americans. Okay, or you can take this to the feminist movement in the 1840s, right? So the Declaration of Sentiments, which I don't know if you've read that recently. Do you just sit around and read historical documents on the weekends? But let's listen to what happens here. This is a document that comes out of Seneca Falls in 1848. Douglass was a delegate there. He actually was one of the few men who signed the Seneca Falls statement, the Declaration of Sentiments. And pay attention to the language here, how they leverage the promise of the Declaration. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal. Right? I picture that almost like with a level of accusation, right? That all men and women are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Such has been the patient sufferance of the women under this government, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to demand the equal station to which they are entitled. Okay? Right, that's not that sort of powerful statement. That's not there without the Declaration, right? Without the promise of the Declaration. Move into the 20th century now. And the story of the United States after the destruction of slavery is the story of the growth of industrial capital, of John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie and these people, almost all men, right, who built these momentous fortunes on the back of the suffering of working people. Children, right? Child labor was legal in many places. Okay? That's how they built their fortunes, and they were lauded as American heroes. But for most people, they were poor. They had no rights in the workplace. If they got hurt on the job, they were just thrown out in the street. Right? That was the problem of American history from the 1860s until about the 1930s, maybe even a little bit longer. And that seems pretty relevant today too, right? I mean, you see the UAW workers, Starbucks workers, all of them out there organizing. They're not organizing because it's fun to go on strike. You know, they're doing it because they know that that with the power amassed against them, that's the only way they're going to have better lives. So in the 30s, right, after you have hundreds of thousands, millions of workers walking out and organizing, FDR gets elected president. Okay, and he gives a very famous speech in 1936 when he's running for re-election, and this is after a year of reforms, right? The right to organize and form unions and to go on strike, by the way, comes in 1935 after millions of workers are pushing Democrats in Congress to do something about this. And FDR gives a speech, a very famous speech. It's probably the most radical speech you'll ever hear a presidential candidate give. And he tells a different story of America. He says that we've got some new problems in the 1930s, right? Gives this speech in Philadelphia, and he talks about the American Revolution, and he says, it was to win freedom from the tyranny of political autocracy that the American Revolution was fought. That victory gave the business of governing into the hands of the average man, who won the right with his neighbors to make and order his own destiny through his own government. Political tyranny was wiped out at Philadelphia on July 4th, 1776. Michael Harrington quote, right? Men and women taking their own destiny. But FDR said there was a new problem because out of this new civilization, the more modern civilization, economic royalists, and he used that word very explicitly to connect them to kings and queens, economic royalists, John D. Rockefeller, those types. I didn't wake up this morning thinking I was going to talk so much about John D. Rockefeller, but here we are. He said, new kingdoms were built upon concentration of control over material things through new uses of corporations, banks, and securities. The whole structure of modern life was impressed into this royal service, right? That it's un-American for corporations to amass this kind of power. That's what he's saying. And he says, for too many of us, the political equality we once had was meaningless in the face of economic inequality. Against economic tyranny such as this, the American citizen could appeal only to the organized power of government. The collapse of 1929 showed us the despotism for what it was. The election of 1932 was the people's mandate to end it, and under that mandate we are ending it. And then he basically concludes by saying, these economic royalists complain that we seek to overthrow the institutions of America. What they really complain of, wouldn't have talked so dramatically. FDR was actually kind of a boring speaker. What they really complain of is that we seek to take away their power. Our allegiance to American institutions requires the overthrow of this kind of power. Could you imagine Joe Biden saying that? I can't. I wish I could. Now, as always, in vain they seek to hide behind the flag and the Constitution. In their blindness, they forget what the flag and the Constitution stand for. Now, as always, they stand for democracy, not tyranny, for freedom, not subjection, and against a dictatorship by mob rule and the overprivileged alike. Okay? So FDR wasn't just saying this because he was a smart guy, although he was saying this because these were the forces that were impelling him, right, to make these changes. This is our past. This is our heritage. This is our legacy as Americans. And don't let anybody take that away from you, right? The legacy of economic democracy, that's who we are. Because you can't really have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness if you don't have a roof over your head and a job where you're not made to feel like you're worthless and your boss has all the power, okay? And then we can move into the civil rights movement, which extends both the promise of racial equality built on Douglass, right, and the abolitionists, but also the economic democracy. So you've all heard of the March on Washington in 1963, and you know King's speech. I'm not gonna talk about King's speech. You all know that one. I'm gonna tell you about A. Philip Randolph's speech. A. Philip Randolph was the president of a union called the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, and a very prominent labor and civil rights activist because he built that union so big. And he also was an activist that pushed white labor leaders to be more inclusive of black workers. And the March on Washington was an idea he had going back to the 1940s, right? They wanted to march to force Roosevelt to open up jobs to black workers. But civil rights activists called that off, in the context of the war. So that finally happens in 1963. It's Randolph's idea. King just kind of shows up and gives a speech, honestly. Like, it was Randolph and this dude named Bayard Rustin that really organized things. And thousands of anonymous activists, right? Many of them women doing everything from, making lunches to directing traffic. But in Randolph's speech that day, he does more than just say, I have a dream that not that I'm opposed to that, but like that I have a dream that men and women, or that blacks and whites will be treated equally. He talks about the civil rights movement, think about this, as the advance guard of a massive moral revolution for jobs and freedom. This revolution reverberates throughout the land, touching every city, every town, every village where black men are segregated, oppressed, and exploited. But this civil rights revolution is not confined to the Negro, nor is it confined to civil rights for our white allies. For our white allies know that they cannot be free while we are not. And we know that we have no future in a society in which 6 million black and white people are unemployed and millions more live in poverty. The sanctity of private property takes second place to the sanctity of the human personality. It falls to the Negro to reassert the proper priority of values because our ancestors were transformed from human personalities into private property. Negroes are in the forefront of today's movement for social and racial justice because we know we cannot expect the realization of our aspirations through the same old anti-democratic social institutions and philosophies that have all along frustrated our aspirations. So what Randolph is saying here is that racial equality demands economic justice. Okay, drawing on, again, the American tradition and casting the widest possible base for social solidarity. And then we come to King. And King, as many of you know, was murdered by a white supremacist in Memphis, my hometown, in 1968. But a year before King died, before he was murdered, he gave a speech, a year to the day actually, April 4th, 1967 in New York City. And it was a momentous, how much time do I have left? Am I good? Yeah? Okay. I just don't want to overstay my welcome, okay. 1967, he gives this speech. And it was a big moment because this was when speech came out, or when King came out in opposition to the Vietnam War. Okay, and this, I mean, you know, King was, I won't say the darling of American politics because he wasn't. I mean, the FBI tried to discredit him. I mean, that's documented. But you know, he was seen as like the well-behaved civil rights activist compared to Malcolm X and others, right? But this speech kind of, I think, turned a lot of conservative white Americans against him when he came out against the war. And what he talked about was connecting the war to how Johnson's war on poverty and the civil rights movement were kind of stalling out a little bit. And part of it was about how American resources were going to the war effort. But he was also saying that the same impulse to fight the war in Vietnam was dispossessing African Americans in the United States, right? That those things were linked is a profoundly important piece of political theory. Actually, you should read the speech if you're at all interested. I'm just going to read a very small quote. You've probably heard this before, but he says basically we need a revolution of values, right? Again, drawing on the American promise, he says we need a revolution of values. A true revolution of values will cause us to question the fairness and justice of many of our past and present policies. On the one hand, we are called to play the Good Samaritan on life's roadside, but that will only be an initial act. And you all know the story of the Good Samaritan, right? I don't need to tell it to you, okay. One day we must come to see that the whole Jericho road must be transformed so that men and women will not be constantly beaten and robbed as they make their journey on life's highway. True compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It is coming to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring. Okay, and I could point to all kinds of activists in the years since that have that would make us all proud. Whether those are, you know, the LGBTQ activists at Stonewall who decided in New York City in 1969, who decided they'd had enough of police repression. Or whether those are the workers at Starbucks, again, who still don't have a contract, but you know, in the face of incredible opposition, voted to have a union and are still fighting for a contract. Or all those workers on the picket lines with the UAW, or the teachers who marched during Act 10, or all of the teachers and professors across this state who are standing up to make sure that you know, all of our young people have the education that they're entitled to as Americans, right? I could use the image, for me, this is the one that always gets me when I think about the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama in 1965, and John Lewis and all those other civil rights activists mustering up the courage, knowing what was waiting, like being able to see what was waiting on the other side for them. So when people tell you that this isn't a country to be proud of, or that we don't have a tradition that can nourish us for the fights that we have ahead of us, think about all those other people, because all the people that I've mentioned, there's many more too, but that's really what it means to be an American, okay? Those are the people that inspire me. Those are the people that keep me going every day, and I hope they'll be the kind of people who keep you going every day too, because that is our legacy. So thank you.